Hi, where are you watching from? Drop your city and country in the comments.
The air inside the reinforced titanium command sphere of Deep-Submergence Station 7 did not mimic the clean, conditioned oxygen of a naval vessel. It was heavy, slightly stagnant, and saturated with the faint, metallic tang of recycling scrubbers and the sharp, hot circuit smell of high-voltage transformers handling the power tethers of the abyssal ROVs. It carried the subtle, ominous scent of deep-sea operation, a mix of specialized synthetic ester lubricants engineered to resist compression at 400 atmospheres, and the ghostly, chemical trace of hydrogen sulfide leaking past secondary laboratory containment cells. Through the thick, multi-layered acrylic viewing blocks, there was nothing but the absolute, crushing blackness of the Marianas Fracture, broken only by the intense, high-intensity halogen beams of our external arrays. The light illuminated the massive, towering silhouette of an active hydrothermal vent, a black smoker that erupted with a silent, terrifying velocity, pouring a dense, mineral-heavy superfluid at plus 400 degrees directly into the freezing 2-degree abyssal floor. The entire structure of the substation vibrated with a continuous, ultra-low frequency rumble that passed straight through the heavy steel framing into the soles of my dynamic boots. The acoustic footprint of 300 bar injection pumps forcing cold seawater back into the geothermal heat exchangers. I sat on a low, bulkhead-mounted iron bench near the multi-channel spectrographic recorders, my heavy neoprene face command vest, thick, scarred by old deep-sea brine stains, and carrying the faded bronze insignia of the Federal Oceanographic Security and Abyssal Asset Commission, zipped tightly to my throat. For 45 years, my official title within the National Subsurface Research and Deep-Sea Infrastructure Directorate had been Chief Hydrothermal Arbitrator and Senior High-Pressure Phase Dynamics Analyst. In the slick, high-gloss digital animations shown at the annual executive summits of the Modern Ocean Energy Consortiums, my deep-level validation laboratory was presented as an expensive, slow-moving historical anchor from the early man-submersible era. The new private venture operator, Abyssal Vanguard Core Dynamics, had long since transitioned to using fully automated downhole laser diode refractometers, remote fiber optic temperature arrays, and cloud-based fluid phase predictive algorithms that treated an unstable, hyperpressurized supercritical water loop at 400 atmospheres as a simple, harmless blue vector chart running on an executive's tablet screen. They genuinely believed that mining supercritical mineral brines from the deep oceanic crust was nothing more than a matter of selecting an extraction velocity on a touch screen panel and letting remote hydraulic actuators handle the flow gate balancing. But digital refractometers do not calculate the microscopic crystalline alteration that occurs inside a heavy Inconel alloy valve gate when a sudden pressure drop forces supercritical fluid to instantly transition back into subcritical water, creating a phenomenon known as flash-cavitation. They don't hear the tiny, ultra-high-frequency metallic ticking sound inside an abyssal heat exchanger that indicates dissolved silica is solidifying into rock-hard quartz crystals long before any volumetric flow drop registers on a remote surface control array. I was the man who knew the exact physical weight of an undisturbed hydrothermal column, the precise acoustic pitch of a stable supercritical flow stream, and exactly how many microns a titanium valve sleeve could expand before the phenomenon of baric shock would rupture the primary containment loop, turning the entire undersea laboratory into a self-imploding vacuum cage. I was not a maritime investment director, a deep-sea asset manager, or a cloud software programmer. I was a physical reader of fluid density, phase boundaries, and mechanical stress who had spent half his life looking at the weeping seals of deep-water high-pressure lines, reading the silent, destructive structural warnings that the automated telemetry systems were too blind to isolate. My sister's son, Julian, stood near the primary Benthic flow control kiosk, his spotless, anti-static blue technician's coat carrying the sharp, clinical smell of an offshore corporate briefing room as he verified an operational checklist on his tablet. He was 35, the regional director of Deep Sea Resource Extraction Velocity for Abyssal Vanguard. A man whose entire professional acceleration was built entirely around extraction cycle compression, which in practical terms meant reducing the mandatory 72-hour thermal stabilization and system priming loop to 40 minutes, forcing deep-sea turbine pumps to run past their critical hydrodynamic cavitation limits to clear the mineral tanks faster and threatening Union Master submersible pilots with immediate termination if they delayed a cargo shuttle due to microimpurity alerts. The automated phase purity certification from our surface network is already logged into the Global Maritime Asset Ledger, Uncle Arthur, Julian said, his voice holding the rapid, sharp tempo of an executive whose performance bonus was tied directly to clearing the deep or extraction window before the International Metal Exchange's financial quarter closed. Our digital sensor arrays verified the fluid density across 4,000 independent sectors along the primary seabed conduit. The phase stability curve is completely flat. The extraction block is operating at maximum efficiency. Honestly, at 81, monitoring the lower turbine deck with a manual acoustic bar and an old mechanical pressure flask just to check the casing seals is an absurd waste of your remaining physical energy. You're holding up the extraction shuttle schedule. He was presenting my systematic exclusion from the deep-sea hydrothermal management roster not as a cold corporate firing, but as a compassionate, protective retirement arrangement designed to save my aging limbs from the freezing abyssal drafts. This is the precise, clinical script of modern corporate liquidation. You never tell a master deep-sea fluid dynamics engineer that his eyes can read the stability of a supercritical water bath more accurately than your uncalibrated software simulations. You tell him he is too fragile for the depth. The downhole digital sensors only read the light refraction inside the pre-polished monitoring glass. Julian, I said, my voice low, holding the flat, gravelly weight of a man who spent 40 years speaking over the deafening scream of high-pressure abyssal injection turbines. The computer doesn't see the silica migration occurring behind the main valve seating near the lower vent gate. The phase change simulation model was engineered by the leading deep-water propulsion group in Bremen. Arthur, he replied, sliding his tablet into his leather folder with a swift, aggressive motion. We don't need an old submaster using an analog dial to tell us if a containment seal is maintaining its boundary. We are on a 24-hour countdown to initiate the full-velocity mineral extraction phase for the abyssal 7 heavy cargo shuttle before the global shipping window locks. My corporate partners and I have already finalized your housing package at the Ocean Vista Sanctuary. It's an exclusive luxury community in the high coastal cliffs with its own climate-controlled glass sunrooms, private paths, and total isolation from heavy industrial utility sectors. What Julian completely left out of his fast-paced corporate summary was the fact that his advancement to Senior Vice President of Global Resource Logistics was entirely dependent on clearing the deep-sea extraction route before the end of the fiscal month, and that his private investment syndicate had already shorted the stock of our independent safety testing laboratory to clear the path for a fully automated terminal conversion the moment my regulatory inspection office was shut down. The structural friction between my physical experience in the command sphere and my nephew's digital velocity schedule reached a dangerous limit exactly 12 days later, during the production drawdown of the main Benthic Conduit 7 Hydro. The component was a massive, 3-kilometer-long vertical titanium riser pipeline designed to handle an internal fluid pressure of 400 atmospheres while carrying supercritical mineral brines from the seafloor straight to the surface production platforms. To the regional transport office, it was a high-value utility asset that needed to be brought up to full operating speed within 8 hours to avoid a severe non-compliance fine from the logistics network. To Julian, it was the final physical benchmark that needed to be verified before the corporate directors arrived for the public ribbon-cutting ceremony at the launch complex's new automated lower-level loading wing. He came down to the flooded wet porch chamber of Sector 7 during a heavy, gray Friday afternoon deep-sea maintenance shift, his thin-soled dress, shoes getting instantly coated in salt crust and grease near the high-pressure recovery valves. He was accompanied by a man named Vance, the newly appointed Commissioner of Regional Maritime Infrastructure Compliance, a 35-year-old business logistics graduate whose understanding of deep-sea fluid mechanics was entirely limited to what he had memorized from data simulation slides during his management courses. "Mr. Thorne," Vance said, his voice carrying the sharp, defensive pitch of a corporate bureaucrat whose schedule was being disrupted by a laboratory technicality. "We've reviewed the electronic readouts from the riser's primary hydrostatic gauges. The internal telemetry shows zero pressure fluctuations along the primary extraction segment. We need you to sign the formal thermodynamic clearance certificate so the technicians can pull the manual isolation clamps and let the automated system ramp the Benthic turbine pumps up to full capacity." He held out a sleek, plastic-shelled clipboard with a digital signature application open, a legal document that would completely clear Abyssal Vanguard of any engineering liability if the high-pressure riser collapsed or the supercritical fluid caused a catastrophic structural hydraulic shock wave along the substation infrastructure. "The digital sensors are reading the fluid velocity inside the smooth center of the line, Mr. Vance," I said, keeping my hands buried inside the thick, brine-stained pockets of my canvas inspector's coat. "They aren't reading the phase separation building up behind the secondary filtration screen. The depth outside isn't the problem. The internal fluid transition is." Julian stepped directly into the gap between me and the compliance commissioner, his teeth grinding with frustration, his voice rising to a shout to be heard over the deafening, high-pitched mechanical howl of the massive vacuum displacement turbines. "Arthur, let's end this old-timer performance right now. The loading software calculates phase transitions and pipe expansion automatically based on fluid density. Every hour this capsule remains throttled back costs the Syndicate $90,000 in delayed delivery penalties. Your refusal to sign this certificate is a direct breach of your regulatory mandate. If that screen isn't touched by 5 o'clock, Vance and I will initiate an emergency administrative override under the Maritime Infrastructure Fast Track Act." He stepped closer, his face inches from mine, his eyes wild with a cold, financial desperation that contained no trace of family loyalty. "We know what this is about, old man. You're terrified that this entire complex is going to run on automated switches without your signature on a piece of paper. But your era is dead. If you don't clear this line, we will have facility security escort you off the well site for domestic obstruction, and your state pension's premium medical fund will be frozen pending an immediate compliance review." He leaned in until the condensation from his hard hat dripped onto my collar. "The Ocean Vista Sanctuary doesn't take residence with an open state investigation, Arthur. You'll be spending your winter in a state-run tenement down by the industrial docks where the tap water smells like sulfur and the floor vibrates every time a waste barge pulls in. Sign the clearance and let the motors roll." The final confrontation did not take place in the damp darkness of the wet porch. It occurred 48 hours later inside the ultra-modern, glass-walled conference suite of the International Maritime Risk Underwriters Group on the 74th floor of the Continental Tower, a building that looked down onto the city harbor like a concrete fortress. Julian had arranged an emergency technical arbitration hearing, using an unmarked corporate vehicle to transport me from the subsurface base as if I were a piece of non-functional laboratory equipment being brought before a panel of corporate bankruptcy referees. Chairman Geller, the senior risk underwriter whose global fund had guaranteed $400 million against the completion of the Sector 7 Deepwater Corridor, sat at the head of the long obsidian table. Next to him sat Julian, his laptop open to a high-fidelity fluid dynamic simulation titled Project Supercritical, Fluid Flow Optimization, and Commissioner Vance, who was quietly reviewing a stack of pre-signed environmental waivers. "Mr. Thorne," Chairman Geller began, his voice low, dry, and entirely devoid of human inflection, the voice of a man who measured the world solely in risk-adjusted capital returns. "Your nephew has provided this panel with an exhaustive, data-driven analysis of the Sector 7 hydrothermal curve. The digital metrics indicate that the fluid density is entirely stable and capable of handling the maximum velocity profile. Your continued refusal to sign off on the thermodynamic clearance appears to be based on personal stubbornness rather than any measurable engineering reality. The monitor on the obsidian wall flashed an animated loop of the seabed, showing the supercritical fluid moving smoothly through blue digital channels into the riser pipeline, the interface glowing with a bright, reassuring green that indicated zero risk of structural failure. The simulation is running on an idealized static model. Chairman, I said, standing up from my seat without using the armrests. I didn't reach for a USB drive. Instead, I reached into my clean rigger's bag and placed 3 separate valve components onto the polished surface of the table. Each heavy piece of Inconel alloy was 6 inches thick, its hard metallic face completely pitted, hollowed, and torn into a fragile, sponge-like network of microscopic craters by high-velocity cavitation forces. In October of 1999, I said, my voice cutting through the room's silent air conditioning with the absolute authority of an old substation master's voice. The sister system of this project, the Benthic Line 3 riser, attempted to extract hydrothermal fluids under identical velocity parameters. The company computers at the time stated the internal valve facings were perfectly free of structural impurities. But the computers didn't calculate what happens when a minor pressure gradient shifts by a fraction of a bar over a 9-month operation cycle, introducing a micro-scale phase change into a supercritical fluid stream. Julian slammed his hand onto the table, the glass cups rattling against the granite trim. The 1999 incident used early first-generation cast titanium, Arthur. Sector 7 uses an advanced forged Inconel 900 matrix that was formulated and certified by our metallurgical team last month. The alloy was certified in a static freshwater cell, Julian, I replied, looking directly at Chairman Geller, whose eyes had shifted from the simulation screen down to the pitted, sponge-like valve components on the table. Your extraction crew didn't realize that the seismic shift during the test run last Tuesday morning didn't just clear the vent. It introduced a micro-restriction along the lower manifold wall 4 kilometers below the surface. That pitting on the valve face isn't standard wear. It's the result of an active flash-cavitation boundary event. Your automated system is reading the tube pressure as stable because the high-velocity fluid is temporarily blowing past the restriction. It's not a balanced extraction line. It's a 3-kilometer-long barrack cannon. I pointed out the window toward the gray outline of the ocean harbor in the distance. Right now, the supercritical fluid transitioning behind that compromised valve seating is creating an invisible gas pocket as the fluid drops below its critical pressure boundary. Because your sensors are calibrated to read fluid purity at the center of a line rather than phase-induced temperature shocks along the pipe borders, your software thinks the system is balanced. The moment you pull those manual safety clamps to increase the turbine frequency for the final hot run extraction sequence, the high-velocity pressure drop won't just move the brine. It will initiate an instantaneous flashing wave against that gas barrier. The resulting barrack shock won't just rupture a joint. It will shatter the entire seabed installation, destroying the abyssal 7 shuttle on its tethers and imploding the substation capsule instantly. In the mechanics of deep-sea high-pressure dynamics, there is an absolute physical boundary known as the critical flash-cavitation threshold, the exact thermodynamic limit beyond which a supercritical fluid dropping below its pressure boundary will spontaneously expand into subcritical vapor, generating a localized sonic shock wave that tears solid steel and titanium alloys into porous scrap within a fraction of a second. It is a mathematical reality that cannot be negotiated by an executive vote, amended by a maritime utility commissioner, or hidden behind a corporate spreadsheet. I pulled a small, brine-faded red ledger from my inside pocket. The original 1999 deep-sea hydrothermal disaster and high-pressure phase registry, certified by the Federal Bureau of Maritime Safety and bearing the permanent restrictive red stamp supercritical exclusion number 992 flash. It was a physical document that existed entirely outside the company's cloud infrastructure, an original regulatory safety mandate that could not be wiped by a system update or bypassed by a state fast-track development waiver. Under Chapter 15 of the Federal Hydrothermal Safety Code, I said, placing the ledger directly over Julian's laptop keyboard. Any deep-sea extraction system that exhibits evidence of valve seating erosion or phase boundary flashing must immediately enter a mandatory technical lockdown. The line must be flooded with cold subcritical seawater. The automated extraction turbines are frozen by operation of federal law, and the clearance is suspended until a physical ultrasonic wall validation can be performed by a licensed federal inspector. The boardroom became completely silent, save for the faint, high-altitude creak of the glass wall as a fresh wind gust hit the building. Chairman Geller leaned forward, his eyes locking onto the federal red stamp on the canvas cover. He looked up at Vance, his voice dropping into a razor-thin whisper that signaled the immediate end of his professional patience. "Is this safety exclusion active in the Maritime Regulatory Archive, Commissioner?" Geller asked. "Did your department approve an extraction fast track that violates a federal supercritical phase mandate?" Vance's hand shook as he reached for his glasses, his face turning an ashen, translucent white as he tried to navigate a regulatory database on his phone that he didn't know how to search. The digital infrastructure portal doesn't show the pre-2005 Subsurface Material Exclusion Acts. We assumed those restrictions were resolved during the digital data migration sweep of 2012. The physical laws of phase dynamics aren't subject to your data migrations, Vance, I said, taking my manual back from the table. If your operator pulls those manual clamps tonight before the system is isolated and flooded, the cavitation shock will rupture the riser before the cargo shuttle can secure its connection. You won't be setting an extraction record. You'll be reading the obituary of every technician sitting in that command sphere when the substation implodes. Chairman Geller stood up, his face completely expressionless, but his voice carrying the finality of a court judgment. The insurance clearance for the Abyssal Vanguard project is formally revoked, effective immediately. Freeze the extraction sequence. Get the maintenance crews back into the wet porch and flood the riser before the line undergoes a wave collapse. Julian sat frozen by his chair, his laptop screen reflecting a series of automated warning notifications that his software was finally starting to generate as the localized cavitation heat along the valve borders began to register outside normal operational limits. "Uncle Arthur, you old lunatic, you've ruined us. The Resource Syndicate. They will call the primary manufacturing bonds tomorrow morning. We've already leveraged our entire corporate capital account against the completion timeline. If that certificate is frozen, we're completely bankrupt by Friday." "I didn't leverage your capital against a corrupted supercritical loop, Julian. Your own arrogance did," I said, packing my eroded alloy components back into my rigger's bag. "You thought that because an old analyst had salt on his sleeves, his memory was dead and his logbooks were garbage. But an analyst's job is to read the reality of the material, not the profit of the developer. The collapse of Abyssal Vanguard core dynamics was not a gradual decline. It was a sudden, vertical liquidation that erased the company from the National Maritime Registry within 90 days. The International Resource Consortium and the National Maritime Development Board withdrew their $400 million financing agreements within 48 hours of a federal engineering team confirming the extensive valve seeding erosion and cavitation deformation along the Sector 7 extraction line. The cost of running an emergency riser flood, laser realigning the 3-kilometer vertical sleeve, and rebuilding the heavy Inconel manifold blocks exceeded $56 million, a capital expenditure that made the entire deep-sea infrastructure project completely unprofitable. Without the expected completion bonus to clear his secondary credit lines, Julian's partnership filed for Chapter 7 liquidation before the winter storms had closed the northern shipping channels. His luxury performance vehicle was towed out of his suburban driveway in mid-January, a quiet financial repossession witnessed only by the local snowplow drivers who watched the bank's agents load it onto a flatbed truck in the gray morning slush. Julian called my office line once during the spring thaw, his voice hollow, flat, and completely stripped of his former corporate cadence. He spoke for less than 2 minutes, asking if I could use my standing as a lifetime member of the Deep Sea Engineers Guild to help him secure an entry-level position as an assistant valve pressure recorder on the low-priority municipal harbor pipelines in the southern delta. I told him that the harbor lines were using automated drone sweeps now, and that the computers had no operational space for an executive who didn't understand how to read the physical pressure of a critical phase line. I was not moved to the Ocean Vista Sanctuary. The Maritime Safety Council quietly canceled my retirement notice the following Monday afternoon. They realized that without my specific physical understanding of supercritical fluid dynamics and the undigitized cavitation exclusions, they couldn't certify a single deep water facility in the extraction division without risking a structural explosion that would void their national insurance policy. They created a permanent position for me, Chief Hydrothermal Integrity Arbitrator and High Pressure Systems Custodian for the Benthic District. My salary is now paid directly out of the nation's core emergency defense account, more than enough to keep my office warm through the winter storms without ever needing to look at a corporate senior community brochure.